Maitreyabandhu. I don't usually teach on a Monday. It's actually quite unusual to be on a Monday. Normally I'm leading a men's discussion group upstairs. Actually, I brought the whole group with me. They've become part of the team, whether they liked it or not. Yeah. Anyway, it's very good to be here. Good to be here. So, what we're going to do for the next 5 weeks, as Sivadramati was saying, is we're going to be exploring the life of the Buddha. And yes, not as history, but as myth. Not as history, but as myth. Actually, the history is very difficult to know what the history really would be. If you want to, I do recommend Vishwapani's book on the Buddha. It is a very good attempt to write a history. I feel strangely uninterested in history. I quite like history, but I don't. When it comes to the life of the Buddha, I'm not particularly concerned with, the history of it. What I want is, I think, a story, an inspirational story, a mythic story that tells me about the mythic patterning of human life. I think there is actually a value in hagiography. That's the traditional stories of the saints. They're called hagiographies, which means that they've got a very loose relationship to truth. Or another way is they're exaggerating the good bits. People quite easily are quite dismissive about hagiography, but I think it actually does serve a genuine purpose to inspire, to feel a connection with a figure, a person whose life becomes a kind of emblem, a kind of talisman for what your life could become. And that's how I want to approach the Buddha's life story. As a kind of mythic pattern for not a life, but the life. I think the Buddha's life story is a mythic pattern for what our lives want to be, if you see what I mean. But most of us can't, and I include myself, can't live up to that mythic pattern. But it is it's a basic template of what our life wants to be, what human consciousness naturally, instinctively wants to be. It's not like we're looking at a life of 2,500 years ago of this man, Gautama, who became the Buddha, and isn't that interesting? It's more like trying to look at, through his life, at what human life is trying to manifest. It's trying to manifest enlightenment. That is the inner meaning of being human, is to, you often talked about perfect that, which is a very Christian word really, and is, I think, rather confusing because it has all kinds of connotations. But the consciousness, our human consciousness, has within it the urge to fully flower, to fully manifest itself. And that urge that consciousness has within it to fully flower is felt by us. It's not just it's not an abstract urge. It's not a idea. There's something in ourselves, something in consciousness that wants to completely manifest itself. And this is true of everything. An apple, as it were, wants to completely be an apple and then presumably drop off a tree. A beetle wants to completely manifest its beetle-like nature. Human beings want to completely manifest themselves. And they're never satisfied until they do. So human beings want to completely manifest themselves. And that complete manifestation of being human is figured by this figure, the Buddha figure. The Buddha represents ourselves, our consciousness, but even consciousness sounds a bit heady, but feelings, emotions, thoughts, body, completely revealed, completely free, completely manifested in the same way that a little grubby caterpillar thing manifests itself eventually in a butterfly, and it's in its nature right from the start somehow is to have wings, an unimaginable transformation. Even after all this time, the butterfly is not completely a cliche. There is some unimaginable translation and some unimaginable transformation to go from a grub to something with wings. So we have within us that. Here and now we have within us something that becomes perfectly analogous to the butterfly's wings, something we could never have imagined that we have, and so on. An oak, an acorn, has it within itself to become an oak tree. Again, a completely unimaginable transformation. If you said to an oak tree, what do you want to be when you grow up? If you said to an acorn, what do you want to be when you grow up? They want to be a bigger, shinier acorn, an acorn with attitude. An acorn in designer clothes, an acorn with a car, and a salary, an acorn could never imagine its potential. Yeah? So our human situation is exactly like an acorn, exactly like a little grub, that we can't imagine what we can become. That goes very deep, I think. We literally can't imagine it. So because we can't imagine it, we often fail to imagine. We become habituated to our grub-likeness, to our acornness. We habituate to that. We think it's all there is. We often get little intimations that that's not the case. Recently, I don't know why I wasn't going to say this, but recently I had this dream. I don't usually talk about my dreams because I don't often remember them, which I always think is another black mark on my spiritual copybook. I can't remember my dreams. But I recently had one about Adhisthana. I go up to Adhisthana, where Bhante lives, very often now. I had this dream that I went up again, and I'd not ever realised, but there was a cathedral next door to Adhisthana, and it had just been restored, this beautiful cathedral, and it was the first day of its opening. I think Yanavatra and I and a few of us others, Maitreyabandhu, we all went to look at this cathedral. And we went in room after room of this cathedral. It was absolutely staggering place. I remember this reading room, which was just incredible, incredible kind of architecture. And the roof was thatched, beautifully thatched. It was just literally where the farm is actually next door, was this cathedral. So sometimes you have dreams that suggest an unimaginable potential. Sometimes you touch them, that there's a potential. One of the things for me is that I first touched that potential. Well, not first, but one of my experiences of it when the time I took LSD when I was a young man. I was in Cornwall. A friend of mine gave me a Peter blotting paper with Donald Duck on it, and it's amazing what blotting paper can do. And in that experience in Cornwall, I experienced my mind as I won't go on about drug experiences; they're so dull. But I experienced my mind flourishing. And I remember this friend of mine saying, "It's not the drug that does that; it's just it opens those capacities in your mind." So we might have little glimpses of potential in dreams, in drug experiences. I'm sure you haven't. Any of you have never taken drugs, but take it from me. We might have sometimes experiences in traumatic occasions, sometimes in terribly traumatic ones. It's almost like the pain and trauma of something rings a bell that echoes in another world almost. Sometimes around death you get a sense of something much, much more. Yeah. So the little hints, the little suggestions that we have within us, butterfly-ness, oak tree-ness. Usually, of course, what happens is that we forget them and we live our life as a little grub or as a little acorn. For most of us, that's the great tragedy of our lives. It's not that we do terrible things or even bad things. We just don't do very much with our lives. We pretty much continue in our acornness. In a way, it's difficult not to, because there's so much sort of requires that of us almost. So by dwelling on the Buddha's biography, if we do it in a certain kind of way, a kind of a metaphoric way, and a storytelling way, rather than a one that's using even the text, there's something about stories. I think there's something very important about stories. And stories aren't meant to be repeated verbatim. They have a life of their own, a story. You tell a story, you hear a story, you remember the story, you tell it again, and when you tell it again, it's coloured by you, and embellished by you, and changed by you, even if you're trying not to. There's something about story that carries mythic. I mean, the relationship with story and myth is very strong, isn't it? I was listening to the radio, someone saying, aren't we sick of narrative by now? I'm thinking, no, I'm not. When you were a child, you wanted stories to go to bed. Story is very deep for us human beings, probably because so much of who we think we are is a story. So we can't help but resonate with it. There's something slightly mysterious about stories, because even if they're not very good, you want to find out what happens. I remember I went to visit my sister, and she had EastEnders on or something. And of course it's another affair being discovered. But, I'd only saw a little tiny bit of it, and I wanted to know what happened. I mean, it's pretty obvious what happened. But there's something about a story which immediately takes you, doesn't it, even if it's not a very good story. It's good to tell stories. And in telling stories, they come out differently, and they say different things at different times. You tell the same story at different times in your life, and the time of your life changes the story. The socio-political environment in which you're telling the story changes how the story is heard, what stories show up. Stories appear at different historical times and get forgotten again because the story isn't needed anymore. Yeah, I was struck, for instance, by La La Land coming out. La La Land is really a tribute to the American musical. America, it's said to be the one artistic form that created in America. And it comes out of the Depression. It comes out of a world incredibly divided between the rich and the poor. So you have this fantasist form, this musical, which is nearly often about the stage. It's often about a love story, and it's nearly always a rags to riches story. And I was struck that here we are in 2017, and we're going back to those musicals, those 50s and 60s musicals, because we're once again in that world of incredible differences between rich and poor living side by side in the so-called developed world. America, the UK, the gulf between the rich and the poor is widening in the same way as it did in the Depression and in the 50s and so on. So surprise, we've got this fantasist form coming back, which is about, guess what, I'll go to an audition and I'll get this part and I'll be famous and rich. It's not surprising that the musical will come back. The story of the musical wants to be told again. It's because it serves a human need. Of course, it also, in fantasy, also inoculates you against the realities of your situation. It means that you can dream about fame and success whilst living in poverty. So stories are very important to us. So I thought over the next few weeks, Subhadramati and I will just tell the story. I don't even want to know how far we'll get. This is just my introduction. I haven't got very far. Subhadramati, I can always tell because Subhadramati's eyebrows go higher and higher as I get further and further from the point. I've known her actually almost combust. So I need to keep a strict eye on Subhadramati's eyebrows. So anyway, let's talk about the story. So what I do is just briefly tell you the first part of the story, and then I want to sort of imagine what that story might mean to us now in this context. Yeah. So most of you know the story, but let's just tell it again. So it's a story about a prince, and haven't we heard that before somewhere? It's even sort of a princess and a king. So it's a story about a boy that's born. His mother dies when he's born. Again, we're almost back in the world of musicals straight away. So often they start off in orphanages and things like that, don't they? So in this story, the boy is born, the mother dies, the father's bereft. He's left with this boy. In India, in ancient India, and even now, a boy child is particularly loved and cherished and favoured. Joan of Archer was a boy child. Well, still is a boy child. I was doing. I must try and keep to this story for Subhadramati's sake. Anyway, forget that bit. Anyway, so this boy grows up, and his father is a king. You can see the musical already. His father's a king. His father dotes upon the boy and wants the boy to be completely happy. Wants the boy to completely happy. So he tries to make sure that he is completely happy. So he lives, according to the story, in a palace, of course. And he has all kinds of palaces. He has a summer palace and a winter palace and an autumn palace. So when it's very hot, he can go to the summer palace, which is very cool. And when it's winter, he can go to the winter palace, which presumably has central heating. He has all these palaces for the different seasons, so that none of the seasons touch him. So he can be perfectly happy. And according to the story, his father just peoples this palace with young people. He doesn't. Anyone who's old or ill is sort of turfed off the premises, according to the story, so that Siddhartha, the boy, never has to see those things. He can just live in a world of pure pleasure, a world of pure pleasure, with the usual things as you grow up, dancing girls or dancing boys, depending what your taste is, or both. He tries to create for Siddhartha a world of complete pleasure. I think that's actually very important. I want to come back to that in a bit. A world of complete pleasure, wall-to-wall pleasure. Siddhartha grows up. He marries a beautiful woman, Yashodhara, and they have a beautiful son, little boy. So that's important as well, and I'll come back to that. He's known sex and love and so on. He's not a virgin, so we're not talking about some sort of idea of purity. He grows up. He's athletic. He's good looking. He's rich. He's very happy and healthy. The stories that actually come down to us are very, very small, but I'm wanting to dwell on the story, capital S. So he's a young, he's got everything. He's a boy that has everything, except for he's dissatisfied. Although this is a world of pleasure that he's in, he feels kind of cramped by it. My imagination is that he's bored by it somewhere. What you have to do with the world of pleasure, you have to keep on upping the ante. So if last night it was chorus girls, next night it has to be pole dancers, and next night it has to be cocaine. You have to keep on upping the ante. I'm not speaking from experience here. And I imagine him kind of, being really into pleasure, wanting as much pleasure as possible, not feeling at all guilty about pleasure, not feeling at all that's a bad thing, just a bit irritated that he can't quite get enough of it, or just a sense that actually underneath all that, I'm just a bit bored. Great times, great friends, great lovers, great sex, great whatever, but underneath it I'm just a bit bored. And I can imagine that feeling growing, and then he asks his charioteer, Chanda, to take him outside the palace. And of course the king has forbidden him to go outside the palace. So this world of pleasure that the king has created is also a prison. Doesn't feel like a prison, doesn't appear like a prison, but effectively it is, because he's not allowed to leave. It's got great big gates. It's a prison, but without being aware of it being a prison. And the king, despite wanting the very best for his boy, there's nothing wrong with the king. He's not a bad king. He loves the boy. He dotes on the boy. He wants him to be as happy as possible. But to do that, he has to imprison him. Yeah? And any of you with children will know that instinct, that you want to make life for them completely lovely and enjoyable, and then never painful. Once when I was washing Alex when she was tiny, only 3 or something, I was drying her and I knelt on her toe. Of course, she sort of burst out crying. I just felt so pained to have caused her any pain, Anyone with, if you've had children or do have children, you want to create that pleasure palace where they can't be hurt. Yeah. But to do that, you have to create a prison. And what we're doing very much, modern parenting, is seeming to me to be, in many ways, more and more of a prison. When I was a child, my mother couldn't do that. She was working all the time. My father was working all the time. We were quite poor. Everybody walked to school, and it was walking all the way down a busy high street and all the way back. Nobody ever imagined that you didn't walk to school. It just wasn't in that culture. It was never. No one ever thought that wasn't a good idea. And children were killed sometimes on the street, not in the town that I came from, but although a friend of mine was. So it wasn't that people didn't realise it was dangerous. It was just that you didn't have. My mother couldn't have thought of taking me to school. I'm one of 5. So I walked to school from about the age of 6, or something like when I first went to junior school. Not at all unusual. Now it's unthinkable for most children to walk to school. They think that one of the reasons why children aren't growing up, 22 seems to be the new 19. Sometimes 35 seems to be the new 19. One of the reasons they think that is because you haven't trained in growing up. There's hardly any time now for a child where they're not strapped into the back of their parents' car, where in other words, where they haven't got adults around. They think that actually that period of walking to school might be very important, because basically you practice being an adult, being a responsible adult for that time. So you do have to look out for each other. You do have to know that the world's a dangerous place. Anyway, so the more we try and create a safe place, completely natural though that is, we also create a prison. And you don't grow up in that environment. You create a hothouse. Anyway, so Siddhartha asks his charioteer Chanda to take him out of the pleasure palace, and you can imagine the intrigue around that, trying to sneak out, and so his father doesn't see him, and so forth. We've all done that as well, haven't we? Try to sneak out. I won't go on to my experience, but we've all sneaked out for various reasons. The most obvious one being predominant. Anyway, so he goes out and famously sees the 4 sights. So he sees a sick person, first of all, someone who's sick. So he's never seen someone that's sick before. And he sees someone that's sick. And I imagine it completely perturbing him. The fact of sickness. You've never seen human beings like this. Sickness can be very frightening. When you see someone really sick, it really frightens you. So he sort of thinks, whoa. You can imagine thinking, whoa. I'm not so keen on this outside the palace thing. I'm going to go back so he goes back to the palace. And what I imagine is he tries to forget it, and tries to, dotes on his son a bit more, goes riding a bit more, does his athletics, goes out and goes to the clubs in the palace, enjoys himself, has more sex, all that sort of stuff. Tries to forget it. Reads the odd book, except for he couldn't read, but that's another matter. The sort of things we do is to try to cover over the facts of life. We all do things. He'd be watching Netflix if it was a current, there's box sets of DVDs. But that feeling of limitation nags on him more and more, so he goes out again, and he sees an old person. He's never seen an old person before. Children, for instance, feel slightly frightened of old people. They seem so different and alien, So there's a fear of an old person. Quite sort of horrified by it, because he's been a world of beauty and youth. And you literally... I'm always struck by that because, again, there's something symbolic about that. You remember when you're a teenager, you're vaguely aware of older people, but they're like wallpaper, aren't they? You sort of think, yes, there are all these old people, getting in the way. But you sort of think that won't happen to me. Or you think, sort of will happen to me, but I'll do it in like a really young way. By the time I'm old, I won't be kind of old. It's weird. You sort of know you're going to get old, but those old people are sort of frustrating people on the very edges of your awareness, and in the centre of your awareness is your teenage friends. It's like the light of your awareness is on you and your coterie, and you kind of think that's really it. And then at the edges of that light are a few old people, and then there's rumours of death. But you vaguely think that's not going to happen to me. I'll organise it better. These silly old... There's that wonderful bit in Hamlet's very strongly about this, isn't it? These old fools. Hamlet at one point says, these old fools. And he describes old people in this vicious way. They have rheum coming from their eyes. He had this sort of disgust about being old. It's very like a young man, an arrogant young man who's these old fools. But also you sort of sympathise with him, that sense of just get out of my way so I can do something, Anyway, he goes back again, agonises again, tries to forget it all, and then finally goes out one more time, asks Chandra to take him one more time, and of course he sees a dead person. He's never known death. He sees a fourth time, but we'll leave you with a cliffhanger and come on to that next week. It's very important we come on to that because you get the wrong idea of the whole of this unfolding of our consciousness if we don't include that. But I want to just look at these tiny early bits first. So he sees death itself, the great shock of death, and that he can't forget. He goes back, and he can't forget that. You can imagine him dreaming about that. You can imagine him waking up in the middle of the night with the implications of that. And of course, in this story, which is very like a Disney film or a parable, a legend, he's never seen these things before, but that's clearly a metaphor for effectively he's never seen them. Presumably, what I imagine is of course he's seen those things, he's just not seen them. They've been around him all the time, old age, sickness and death, but he's just not seen them, by which I mean he's not seen the significance of that. And we're all exactly in that situation. There's nothing hyperbolic about that, there's nothing mystical about that. We're all exactly in that situation. We've seen those things, and we've not seen them. We've seen that we will too become sick and grow old and die, but we've not seen it. There must be somewhere a whole philosophy here about the nature of knowing something. Because we do know those things. If someone said, tell you what, it's not true, you just think, it is. You can't unknow it, and in a way, that's quite strong, that knowing. You do know it's the case. You absolutely. And if you said, okay, let's pretend that it's not the case, you think, well, I could, but it is the case. So you do know. What's weird is that you do know it in a certain sense quite strongly, and then in another sense, you don't know at all. Very odd. I think there's something there about the nature of what we mean by knowing something. Because it's not that you know it notionally merely. Even at pain of death, if someone said, tell me that you never die, you couldn't do it believably, And yet, we act. Most of the time, we don't know it. We forget it. Or perhaps better, it's our knowledge of it, our knowledge of those three sites, isn't active. I do think that somebody with a better mind than me needs to think about it. Our knowledge isn't active. It doesn't do anything. It's real. It's substantial even in a certain sort of way, but it's not active. It doesn't do anything. It sort of parks in a part of our mind without really activating our life. In fact, we often act as if it's not true at all. We think we'll be young forever. Most of us are young long after that is an adequate description of us. I've been struck, for instance, about how our self-image is younger than we are. By the time you get to my age, you look in the mirror and go, ah! when did that happen? But my image of myself is younger than I look. It's not literally younger. I don't have black hair. I used to have black hair. I don't have black hair in my self-image. It's not a lie, but it doesn't seem to be as old as I actually look. Very odd, in a way, this self-image we carry. So we have this knowledge that there is old age, sickness and death, but it's not active. Very odd when you think about that, and more needs to be thought about that. What happens with Siddhartha is that knowledge becomes fully active. I think that's what the parable is saying, that something that isn't active suddenly leaps into life and can't be restrained anymore. It's emblematic for something that consciousness is trying to do. Do you see how it is fully true? It's not a fiction, this, not a fantasy. We know it, but it's not active. This is a parable about it becoming completely active, so that you know that you are going to be old, get sick and die. You know that all the way through. You're shocked into that realization. And in the parable form of the story, you can never unknow it. And it's always active, like an active ingredient in everything that you do. For us, it's much more like it occasionally becomes a bit active, particularly if someone close to you dies, or suddenly you'll become sick. But it's amazing how quickly it reverts, isn't it? So many people come to the Dharma, come to Buddhism, come to meditation because those three great facts have become a bit active. Once they settle back down again, you just go back to being an acorn. Even though in the time you think, I must remember this lesson, very, very difficult. It's as if our human minds are actually constructed so as not to remember. Yeah. But this story is about that not happening, that it becomes fully active. So for us, it's not, stories happen outside time, so everything always happens straight away. Love at first sight, etc. Everything happens outside of time, which is translated as happening straight away. Never happens for us like that. We need to gradually wake up to these three truths. We need to actually wake up even more to the fourth truth, but we'll come to that next week. Parables are always outside time. Fairy stories, musicals, they happen outside time. They're a different form, yeah. But we need to get alive to that, gradually. So I just want to say a few more things about the parable, and then we might end with a bit of meditation just to sort of come back to that. So a few more things occur to me thinking about it again. And I really love thinking about this story again. I think it's a story that you can never finish with, because I think it is a story about our human unfolding. So one of the things that really strikes me thinking about it again is the pleasure palace, and how in this story the king creates a prison. And I do think there's something about parenthood in that. We can't help but want to imprison the child, and the child has to break out, sometimes with great damage. Hopefully a good parent will open the door. Sometimes you have to but the child has to break out of that. There's something at that level about the story. But there's also something about pleasure, about the centrality of pleasure in our human lives. Looked at from this place in this moment, we could think of ourselves as pleasure-seeking animals, really. What we want right from the start is pleasure. And at times in our life, we'll do anything for it. Whether it's, the pleasure of sex, whether it's the pleasure of money, whether it's the pleasure of celebrity. So many, again, we're in this fantasist world now because we're in this hugely separated world between rich and poor. So there's more and more fantasist forms like The Voice and Britain's Got Talent. And all that. They're all about you can make it big from nothing. We all want the pleasure of the attention of lots of people. We want the pleasure of success, the pleasure of money, the pleasure of expensive things. Human beings want pleasure, even the pleasure of doing good, or the pleasure of achieving something. They're all a kind of pleasure. Just earlier on today, a few of us, Maitreyabandhu, Jnanavarta and I, and two others, were again, with Maitreyabandhu's wonderful leadership, were still mopping up the issues about building this wonderful retreat centre for Drasana. Do go if you haven't been yet, and keep going. Beautiful, incredible thing. It's a lot of hard work. It's been hard work for all of us, for the three of us, particularly Maitreyabandhu. But it's also to do with wanting the pleasure of that. You'll put a lot of work into something because you want the pleasure from it. So let's remember that that's what we are, pleasure-seeking creatures. We want pleasure. If we don't find it in creating a retreat centre so that many, many people can benefit, we'll find it in lower things. We must have our pleasure. If we don't find it in one thing, we will find it in another. We can't abide life without pleasure. It's almost like consciousness wants pleasure. The trouble is there are so many terrible things, and yet, despite all that, we want pleasure. And I think there's something. I'm just talking, as it were, from this point. I'm walking through the parable from this way. I could walk through from another way, but I think there's something just fine about that. It's fine to want pleasure. That is what we're like. That's who we are. We want pleasure, and we want as much pleasure as possible, and we shouldn't feel guilty about that. There are terrible inequalities which should provoke us to act for the welfare of others, but we cannot get away from this desire to want pleasure. And I don't like this sort of tendency in the developed world for a kind of middle-class guilt about pleasure. It usually doesn't do anyone any good and doesn't help anybody. Great to want pleasure. We all want pleasure. And it's interesting that when you think about pleasure in this story, it starts off with pleasure, and actually a key point later on in the story is the rediscovery of pleasure. I can't help but notice, I hadn't thought about it till today, but later on in the story, which I don't know what week we'll get to, we discover Siddhartha, just about to become a Buddha, rediscovering a deeper, perhaps even the deepest meaning of pleasure, which was absolutely key to him becoming enlightened. So we've got this principle of pleasure, which on one hand is, pole dancers, hobnobs, Netflix stuff, fill in all the rest, all the way up to a pleasure which opens the very door to enlightenment itself. That seems to me to suggest, at least in terms of the parable, that pleasure is absolutely central to the meaning and myth of human consciousness, if you see what I mean. So let's not feel bad about pleasure. let's find it in more and more sustainable, healthy, valuable ways. Yeah. But also what strikes me is that Siddhartha is part of Siddhartha's health. He's not caught up in inner turmoil. He doesn't come across in the little tiny bits of story we have as kind of neurotic, as guilt-ridden, as complicated and averse to himself. He just wants a good time. There's something really healthy about that. And there can be something unhealthy about being spiritual or about thinking of yourself as spiritual. When someone says to me, I'm a spiritual person, I almost want to take a step back. In as much as it's so abstract and so it's difficult to know what on earth that means. And so because I don't know what it means, I slightly want to keep away. If someone says, tell you what, I just want lots of pleasure, but it doesn't kind of work completely, does it? And I think, now we're talking. Because it's real. It's completely real when someone says, and I've got friends who just, that's how they came to the Dharma. They just came to it through, I wanted pleasure, got lots of pleasure, it wasn't enough. That wasn't my route in. My route was in, I found life very painful, and I had to find some meaning in that. And I might come back to that later, but it doesn't suit my purposes for the story. So there's something, and hopefully I'll come back to it as we go on, Sivadramati, and I'll come back to it as we go on, something about the nature of pleasure itself that's absolutely central to human consciousness. Yeah? So this pleasure palace is not just a trivial thing or a prison. It's something that we've got to discover a deeper and deeper meaning to. If we don't do that, we won't travel on this path to enlightenment. What we'll tend to do is give up the path to enlightenment and settle for lower pleasures. We've got to find a deeper meaning to the pleasure palace. So in some ways, it's not about leaving it. In some ways. We'll come back to that later on. But the other ingredient I just want to bring out to finish with is that you've got this pleasure principle that runs all the way through our life, from the first moment to enlightenment itself. And then you've got this dissatisfaction principle. So those two principles run through this early part of the story. The metaphoric, parabolic nature of this story is to bring out the meaning of pleasure and dissatisfaction. So he says he wants to get out of the pleasure palace. A story so often is much, much more accurate than the theory. He wants to get out of that. In other words, the pleasure he's experiencing isn't enough. It leaves him with this dissatisfaction, this edge of dissatisfaction. Very often that's what drives us forward in life. Something that it's not enough. It's not enough. There's an edge of dissatisfaction. And what that's saying is that it's almost like a pleasure dome that he's got. And it's a pleasure dome of we in the first world, we've really spent a lot of time since the Victorians building a pleasure dome that we can just have. So I can just buy a book by pressing my thumb now. I can watch every film on my computer screen upstairs. I don't have to go out. We tried to create, since the Victorians, wall-to-wall pleasure. We've been incredibly successful in that. For those people with money, if you haven't got money, the whole thing closes like an iPod. They don't close, do they? But I've been struck by that. If you haven't got money, the pleasure dome is not open. And it's no wonder that you then go off and think, I'm going to burn it down, because the whole pleasure dome is closed to you if you haven't got money. If you've got money, the whole place is open. But there's this thing about, basically, if you're going to progress on any kind of human path, there needs to be a sense of dissatisfaction with the world. And the world, as I mean it, this place is the world of the story, the pleasure dome, the first world that we've built. and which we're guarding jealously, because we put our slaves elsewhere in the world now. We're not like the Romans having them downstairs. We put them in other countries, making our laptops and so on. So unless there's some dissatisfaction with the world, with coffee and croissants and so on, and everything else, there's no real impetus to grow. So there's this pattern of dissatisfaction. There is a healthy dissatisfaction that Siddhartha has. He's like an image for healthy humanity, and part of that image is that he's dissatisfied. One of the things that we need to clear up as we practice in the earlier stages is our dissatisfaction disillusionment with the world, or is it disgruntlement with it? Disgruntlement just means that you didn't get, you're unhappy because you haven't got a big enough slice of the cake. And you can mix up the two. Are you disillusioned with first world pleasures, or are you merely disgruntled with them because you haven't got enough of them? Very, very difficult to tell the difference. Disgruntlement or disillusionment. Genuine dissatisfaction or irritation because you haven't got a big enough slice. Yeah? So that's one of the things we'll need to kind of gradually, in the real time of our lives, sort out. And then we'll need to gradually sort out in the real time of our life whether we're dissatisfied in this deep sense of the parable of Siddhartha, or whether we're dissatisfied because we're unhappy in the simple psychological sense. For me, the dissatisfaction I felt coming to this class on a Wednesday night when I was 25, there were layers of it. There were definitely, there was a real sort of underlying sense that this world is just not right. It was much less nice than the story. I just thought there's something like deeply wrong about this world and I wanted to destroy it. I was a very nice guy, so I didn't look like that, but that's how I felt. I just wanted to destroy it. I wanted to kick it. I wanted to break it. I had a disgust for it in some way. And I still think that was healthy. But on top of that was, all kinds of psychological unhappinesses, neuroses, self-dislike and so on. So we'll gradually, in the real time of our life, need to sort out existential dissatisfaction that is healthy and vigorous, Siddhartha dissatisfaction, from psychological pain. And we need to make sure we help our own psychological pain and each other's. But that's not primarily, that's not the pain that took the Buddha out of, the Buddha-to-be, Siddhartha, out of the palace. And finally, just to say that the name of the charioteer, Chanda, means instinct. So he asked his instinct about life. He said, I do feel like it's as if there's more to it. And he can't have known that there was more. You have to remember that you're an acorn. You can't know that there's more outside that. He had an instinct that this can't be right. This can't be enough, this world. So he asked his instinct to show him, to take him out of that world. Yeah. So what we'll need to do, the instinct Chanda takes him out, shows him what life is like from a particular point of view. Shows him more than that, and we'll come on to that next week. But what we'll need to do in the real time of our life, not the mythic time of parable, is train our instinct. Our instinct that says that no, this world isn't enough. And separate that from, hatred of the world, guilt about pleasure, and so on. Separate that from all that. Get down to this instinct that just wants more. It's not to do with a self-hating, I shouldn't be enjoying myself thing, which I really think we need to just doesn't do anybody any good, least of all those people that we sometimes tag on to thinking that we're helping. We actually need to devote our whole life to the good of everybody. That's the only solution. That's what the Buddha becomes. But I'll leave it there for tonight. What I want to do is just see whether we can just quietly sit rather than have questions. Perhaps future we'll have questions, but I just wanted to start us off in the parable. Let's just sit quietly and see what that stirred up for us.